Hey everybody, here we are today going to be taking a look at the gifts of some of the trees that grow up here in the North Country, specifically some of the conifers. If you're ready, let's go. The cedar is one of the 4 sacred medicines for Anishinaabe people, and it has a lot of properties, including purification, protection, and other sorts of qualities that make it very important to the Anishinaabe. Pronounce it Gijik in Anishinaabe in the Anishinaabe language. And it's a very special tree. It is one of the most generous trees I can think of. There are so many aspects, so many gifts. There's so many aspects, so many gifts that this tree so willingly gives. And there's so many qualities to it that are just really amazing. So, people have used, with the tree's permission, of course, cedar wood to make things like wild ricing sticks, to make the ribs in birch bark canoes. You can use the bark on it, which is kind of shreddy, and you can take it and shred it up and let it dry, and you can use that as tinder. One of the really interesting things about all of those are important gifts, but one really helpful gift is that its leaves, if you make them into a tea, are very helpful for vitamin C. They will provide you with the vitamin C that you need. In fact, there's a good account in history when the European explorers were first coming over. They were suffering from scurvy, and it was, I don't believe it was an Anishinaabe person, but one of the tribes that was part of the Anishinaabe cultural group offered this tea, the cedar tea, to this group of European explorers. They were going, they're in a bad way with the scurvy, and it cured them. And from that, so I've been told, that's where the term arbor vitae, or tree of life, in the Western tradition comes to describe cedar, or the Gijik for the Anishinaabe. Cedar also is one of those amazing trees. When it grows, there are different root sections to it, and each root section feeds a different part of the trunk. So if one part of the trunk has something happen to it or is damaged, the rest of the tree can survive. The branches also, like the lower branches, and the spruce will do this too, when they're down towards the ground, a lot of times you'll see them going into the ground, and they will separate from the tree and then grow on to be their own trees too. But they first started off as branches of the parent tree. Like also, in a similar way, when a cedar falls in the forest, you might look at that fallen tree and say, oh, that poor cedar is done for. But it's not. You'll start to see over time that those branches start to grow up. And so they themselves actually grow into separate trees too. So a lot of times it's not unusual to find cedar growing in a circle, or to find cedar, growing in a straight line, and that all has to do with, those branches that are able to grow. And it's just a marvelous tree. Perhaps why it can be so long-lived. If you go to places like St. Ignace in the UP, or over to the Garden Peninsula, also in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, you go to these places on the Garden Peninsula. It's down by, is it part of Fayette State Park? There's a cedar forest there that grows on a limestone cliff, considered an extremely unique forest community, because those trees have grown in a really harsh condition, particularly those on the cliff that faces Lake Michigan. But those trees there are somewhere around, some of them are 900 years old, some are over 1,000 years old. So they were old when Columbus landed in this hemisphere over here in 1492. So I love to go there, and I love to go to those places. And I sit there and I think back and I say, these trees, they've seen that time before all this. They've seen the time, that once upon a time, not so very long ago land. They were a part of that. They have that experience, They were living with Anishinaabe people, some of whom may have been my own ancestors, right here, and they may have known them. They may have been old when they knew them. They could have been 500 years old. So it's just really marvelous to walk through a cedar forest and just think on how old these trees can get. Where they're old doesn't mean they're necessarily large and huge. In fact, in the Garden Peninsula there at Fayette, many of them are quite small, especially if they're growing on the edge of the cliff. But they're very old. very old there. So a very, very special tree. One of the 4 sacred medicines for the Anishinaabe, for its many gifts, and I think just it's amazing. It's a wondrous tree, all the different aspects and qualities that it has. Really, really a special tree. All right, so I'm standing here right now between 2 different pine trees. On my left is the white pine, and over there on my right, and a little bit behind me, is the red pine. Now, both of these have a lot of similar qualities, and both can be used to make tea, white pine tea or red pine tea. You can also use the inner bark of both of them to make flour from it. For me personally, and I'm not sure how well this shows up on the camera, but when I look at a white pine from a distance, and you know it can be quite a distance away, that white pine to me looks rather soft, a little fluffy. In terms of the needles, of course, the older a white pine gets, the more distinctive of a shape it gets. And the Upper Peninsula, probably one of the iconic images people have of the UP is the white pine standing tall, one of the tallest trees that you'll see standing. It's got kind of those tufts that stick out, not stick out, but those tufts that go out. It's just a really unique and beautiful outline that the white pine will strike against a shoreline or, rising above a forest. But in terms of needles, if you're looking at 2 tall pines from a distance, you're like, is it red or white? The white pine has, in my opinion, a fluffier look to it, whereas the red pine has a more bristly look to it. But there are other ways to tell as well, mainly the number of needles and the type of bark that these trees have. So if you take a look at the white pine, and white pine, do you mind if I take a clump here? The white pine needles, their clusters have 5 needles, just like there's 5 letters in the term white. So white pine, 5 letters, 5 needles. And that needle, just the needles alone will tell you that it's a white pine. You can also take a look at the bark, and this is a young tree, but a white pine has a smoother, grayer bark. As it gets older, that bark gets furrowed, but it does not get scaly like the red pine. Over here, taking a look at the red pine, and I hope red pine is okay if I take one of these from you. The red pine has longer needles, and it has 2 of them. The red pine, aside from having just the 2 needles to mark it out, also has a distinctive reddish tinge to the bark, and it has scale, like a real scaly bark. This again is a young one, but you can see the difference even between the red and the white pine even when they're young. But as they get older, that red pine is going to develop very distinctive scales. We have the red pine and the white pine, and the red pine will have those 2 needles. The white pine is definitively shorter than the red pine. So the red pine, white pine. Both of them you can make tea from, a white pine tea or a red pine tea. But we're talking about making teas, whether it's talking about making tea from the gijuk or cedar tree, or talking about making tea from the pine trees. You can also sweeten that tea, of course, with another tree, and that would, of course, be the syrup from the maple tree, the maple sap. Or, as the Anishinaabe did in years past anyway, they would make that maple sap, make it down into maple sugar, because it's stored more easily in those birch bark macaques that were sealed with spruce sealant through the winter. So that's about it. That's about a good wrap. I hope you learned a little bit of something new. And if you have anything you want to add, please add them in the comments. I always appreciate those. All right. You guys have a good day, and we will talk soon. Mama P. See you later.